This is the story of two young women.
People were thinking this is a serial killer.
Their murders in a quiet town in the 1980s.
There was quite a lot of blood around Wendy's head, around the bedding.
It became apparent that Caroline hadn't just simply disappeared.
And the extraordinary investigation which brought the killer to justice.
In 2019 we had a breakthrough.
Bingo.
It looks like he's got some hard drives in there, I would say.
An investigation which uncovered the darkest secrets.
Looking at this, excuse me,
of a man who picked his victims from among the dead.
If you listen to what I'm going to say.
yes, every single one of us has that same wish for someone that we've lost, and that's that they rest in peace.
Back in the 1980s, you were very lucky if you saw the inside of a police car. You were walking various beats in the town centre.
Ian Poynton still remembers the events of 1987 in Tunbridge Wells, his home beat.
It was still a fairly affluent town. I mean, it had its areas of poverty, but there was also a sense, I would suggest, of faded glory. There were lots of the big houses that were no longer big houses anymore. They'd been split up into flats or into bedsits.
It was home to two young women, just starting out in life. Wendy Nell was 25, working in the cafe of a department store.
I was the supervisor, and Wendy worked with a lot of other girls and some of the students from schools locally. She wanted to get married. She wanted children, desperately wanted to have children, but I learnt later that she'd got divorced because I'd left the coffee shop by then. But she didn't run back to mum and dad. She struck out on her own, got a different job, worked in Tunbridge Wells, you know, looking forward to the next phase of her life.
Moving to her own flat, to which police were called on the 23rd of June, following a horrifying discovery.
Officers went into the flat and they found Wendy laying on the bed. She was naked, she was laying on her right-hand side, and a duvet that had been placed over her had been pulled back. There was quite a lot of blood around Wendy's head, around the bedding and on the bed sheets.
At 12 o'clock, BBC Radio Kent News with Michael Bath. Police today issued a fresh appeal for witnesses following the murder of the Tunbridge Wells shop manageress Wendy Nell earlier this week.
Caroline Pearce was 20, a manager at this popular Tunbridge Wells restaurant. The centre of a close set of colleagues and friends, young people who worked and socialised together. Until the 24th of November 1987, when Caroline's neighbours heard screams from her flat. She was never seen alive again.
It was originally thought that maybe she had disappeared, but as time went on, of course, it became apparent that she hadn't just simply disappeared.
We got the second murder just 5 months later of Caroline. It was the talk of the pubs. It was the talk of people that you bumped into on the street. They wanted to know, what was happening. I'd got no answers as to how the investigation was going. All you could do was try to reassure them.
3 weeks later, her body was found 40 miles away in the water-filled ditch that was adjacent to the farmer's field. She was laying on her side, submerged in the water, and the only clothing that she had on was a pair of tights.
She'd been found in Romney Marshes, a flat expanse of farms and wetlands.
There were lots of officers brought in to help with a fingertip search around the area. We were looking for items of Caroline's personal possessions to try and find any evidence that might help us understand what had happened to Caroline and who was responsible.
People were thinking this is a serial killer. Once you'd had the second murder, people were waiting for the third murder.
In 1987, the opportunities to gather evidence would have been quite different to what we can do nowadays. There would have been quite a lot of emphasis on what witnesses had seen, what witnesses had heard.
We had uniform officers drafted in doing the house-to-house inquiries. You know, it was huge.
It was Wendy's flat which contained some critical clues.
Wendy's white blouse that she'd been wearing, or last known to have been wearing, that was bloodstained. And on the sleeve cuff of that blouse there was a partial shoe print in blood. There was also other DNA found on that bedsheet and the duvet cover. For Caroline's murder, there was no forensic leads, and back in 1987 there was very limited work that could be done around DNA, for example.
Caroline's tights did have a trace from the killer. When the DNA database was introduced in the 1990s, detectives were hopeful.
It was compared to all of the people that had DNA held on that national database, but there was no match.
The first of this month's reconstructions tells the story of a 25-year-old woman who lived alone in a bedsit at Tunbridge Wells in Kent.
And Tunbridge Wells.
The team tried asking for help on the BBC's Crime Watch programme, which was to feature the Tunbridge Wells murders twice over the years.
We had samples from the scene. We had the offender's DNA from the scene.
They've been kept over the years.
That had been kept. So we recovered them from the scene, and they're always kept in undetected cases for new developments in forensic science.
The months turned into years. A huge murder investigation into a cold case. At Kent Police, it was clear the leads had run out.
We scaled down the inquiry, but one thing that we've never done is close the inquiry.
The old Kent Police headquarters would soon be earmarked for closure. But in 2019, the Tunbridge Wells case came back to life.
We had a breakthrough. We developed the tights that Caroline was wearing when she was found in order to be able to get, for the first time ever, a DNA sample that we believed was from the suspect who had killed Caroline in 1987.
But back then, there was nothing to compare it with.
The police were not taking DNA from people because we didn't have the power. We didn't even know the technology was going to be there.
DNA profiles are a bit like car number plates. One plate, one car. There's been a register of plates since 1904. The database of police DNA profiles only began in 1995, and Wendy's killer wasn't on it. But part of a number plate can tell you where and when a car was registered. And now part of a DNA profile can tell you the family the sample likely comes from.
You can imagine over 65 million people in the UK. There are around 6.5 million profiles on the National DNA Database. Through science, through algorithms, through brilliant individuals, they will narrow that profile down to a population of around 90 people.
90 people who'd given the police their DNA and might be related to the Tunbridge Wells killer. Detectives visited and questioned them about their family members, and one family member stood out.
That person was David Fuller.
We knocked on the door. David Fuller answered the door.
Hello. Morning. David, it's the police. Hello. We need to come and speak to you. Oh, yes.
He invited us in. The uniformed police officers explained to him the reason that we were attending, and he was very calm.
Thank you. David, if you listen to what I'm going to say.
Yes.
Just, we're from Kent Police and we're investigating the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce in 1987. Okay? As part of that investigation, you've been linked as a suspect, both geographically and forensically. Okay? If you listen to what my colleague's going to say to you.
All right, David, you're under arrest on suspicion of the murders of Wendy Nell and Caroline Pierce in 1987. Do you understand? You do not have to say anything, but it may harm your defence if you do not mention, when questioned, something which you later...
I had a very strong suspicion that he was involved from the information that was available to me that he lived in the area at the time. I knew some information around his criminal history and his method of his crime back in the 1970s when he was a convicted burglar.
Convicted but never jailed. By 2020, he was an electrician on his third marriage, trying to give the impression he was Mr. Normal.
Did you know either of these women?
No.
He didn't know their addresses, where they lived, and that there really was no reason that his DNA would be at either of those scenes.
David, did you murder Wendy Nell?
No.
Did you murder Caroline Pierce?
No.
He would make almost a threat to say, if you continue along this path, I'm going to stop answering your questions. And I guess that's another element of control that we see, where he thinks that he can control that interview process.
Can you describe anything else about Wendy's flat for me?
As he faced questions, his small house in Heathfield, East Sussex, was full of police officers.
There was a lot of things in the house. I described David Fuller as a hoarder. We found that he was a keen photographer, and we found thousands, in fact about 50,000 hard copy photographs in his collection.
A member of staff found the photograph of Fuller in his garden in the sun.
The way he was lying allowed police to focus on the distinctive pattern on the soles of his shoes.
Remember the white blouse that we found where Wendy had been killed? On the cuff of one of the sleeves of the blouse was a shoe print in blood. That trainer was the same as left the mark on Wendy's cuff in blood. A golden nugget piece of evidence.
Bingo. We found a note in a diary that he'd visited Buster Brown's, which is where Caroline Pierce was the manageress. We also found that items from Super Snaps where Wendy worked. It is clear to me that he knew Wendy Nell, or who she was. He knew Caroline. He has targeted them for death.
By having that really good current understanding of his life history, we were able to prove that he was lying.
Take a seat, Bruce.
We were able to get a DNA sample from him, and that was an exact match from the offender profile that we'd found at the scene of Wendy, and a match to what we now knew from the forensic link to Caroline. At that point, we thought, here, we've done it. We now knew David Fuller was the offender. But then we found something else.
He's identified the victims.
In 1989, David Fuller secured a job at the Kent and Sussex Hospital.
That Friday evening we were just sort of tidying everything up, ready for him to go to court the following morning.
Let me get the camera.
He was an electrician by trade, and he was a maintenance man.
There's some stuff stuck on the back of that one as well.
And then I got a call. They had found some pictures.
It looks like he's got some hard drives in there, I would say.
He had access to all areas of the hospital, carrying out essential maintenance wherever it was needed. But we found he had a particular interest in the mortuary.
It's a SanDisk one that I can read there at the front, so that's a hard drive.
On opening the hard drives, I'm looking at a mortuary, and I'm looking at a man sexually abusing what are clearly dead people.
And he had filmed it, photographed it, every second. These are his pictures.
A lot of the time he sets up the camera and you can watch everything that he does.
There is a real similarity between what he was doing with the victims in the mortuary to what we've seen from the evidence from the scenes of Caroline and also of Wendy.
My role in this investigation from the outset is to be the eyewitness for what was happening to these women and children. No one else is going to speak for what happened if no one else is going to look at that material, and that happened to be me. And I've seen some horrible, horrible stuff in my career that people really shouldn't have to see. And then looking at this, excuse me.
David's fine, we can stop if you want.
No, I'm fine. It's just a reminder of just how horrible the world can be out there, and it's utterly. I felt sadness, I felt anger, I felt so many different emotions.
Fuller had killed 2 women, and he'd sexually abused the bodies of 98 more, including one 100 years old, and 3 children.
Part of me is trying to understand what must be going through his head. I can only conclude that there's an element of control going on. That's all I can imagine.
Control over women in particular. Echoes of another notorious criminal, Harold Shipman. Dr. Richard Badcock, a forensic psychiatrist, advised police about Shipman. But what's his view of David Fuller?
The psychopathology at work here is very definitely one of sadomasochism, which in essence is not being able to deal with your own issues except by manipulated behaviour of other people. Although you're doing extreme things, you don't feel alive most of the time. You might only feel alive in the moment of the offence. Necrophilia, that's it. There's nowhere else to go after that.
After he had offended and he had recorded, he would take it home, download it to his computers, and he had quite a sophisticated system of files and subfolders where the material would be placed.
And he had a little black book where he logged details of his mortuary victims.
Date of birth, date of death.
It's like a library that he can look back over.
They're the ones in there.
It is perhaps the ultimate of control, because those poor people have got absolutely no say. There's no resistance in any way, shape or form to what is going on.
I've got 15, no idea of 15.
What he was doing, and in such volume, was completely unprecedented. We did research, we spoke to many people in the country, even looked at what was happening internationally to try and understand if there were any other investigations that could assist us to see if we could take advice and guidance. We found nothing.
He was a man with a trusted job in a modern, secure hospital. How did he get away with it?
His job gave him the cover, didn't it, for going into the mortuary. And I think personally, perhaps his rather unassuming nature enabled him to get away with it.
David Fuller had manipulated himself in a position where he was a maintenance supervisor. He had a swipe card that allowed him to access anywhere in the hospital. He changed his shifts to work a later shift rather than a normal day shift. The setup of the mortuary is in 2 halves, and bodies that would be brought into the mortuary would be put into fridges and freezers on one side of the mortuary, all covered by CCTV. The second part of the mortuary, which is not covered by CCTV, where David Fuller went and was able to lock himself in that area, had no cameras, but from the other side of those fridges he could get access to the bodies and take them out of the fridges.
There's a moment during one of the videos where there's a noise from outside the mortuary. I'm not completely sure what it is, but his response is to just turn the light off. And I anticipated, whilst I'm listening, that he's putting the body back or doing something to hide. And then about 5 minutes later, the light comes back on and he's still standing there, just as he was before.
And you must have been praying that he'd be caught at that stage.
That would have been so much better for so many more people had he been caught at any time.
But who had he abused? Police had to find out. They searched hospital records and they scrutinised Fuller's horrific videos.
Looking for parts of the body, whether it's tags or medical devices, anything that could be used, facial imagery, age, build, absolutely everything that would be able to be passed on to my colleagues, so that when they're looking at a list of people, they're able to say, well, it's not that person because of this reason, it's not that person because of this reason, and we narrow it down to just one person.
And once identified, liaison officers were sent to visit the victims' families.
You know that these families have been given a horrific message, and you know that there's nothing that you can say or do that's going to make that any better or make it go away. So all you can do is be there for them and try and help them in any way that you can, which is exactly what we do as family liaison officers.
In 2014, the Akande family came to the UK from France for a short break. After they left the ferry, a lorry hit their car on the motorway. Mary Akande, her sister Helen, and their father were killed. And 6 years later, their family was one of dozens visited by the police investigating Fuller.
We lost our sisters, my mother lost her kids. We're in a nightmare, it's not true, this can be. Two young girls died in every way, and now you just...
Mary and Helen, 16 and 22, their bodies lying in the mortuary, had been among Fuller's many abuse victims, among the 80 who police have identified.
1, 2, 3, 4, till 80 women, and killed 2. And we were saying to ourselves, how come NHS did not saw what this man was doing? How can he be getting into the mortuary, coming out, going there, coming out, without you suspecting anything?
Soon a public inquiry will examine what more should be done to make hospital mortuaries secure places of rest.
Good afternoon. I want to say on behalf of the Trust how shocked and appalled I am by the criminal activity by David Fuller in our hospital mortuary that has been revealed in court this week. And most importantly, I want to apologise to the families of the victims of these terrible crimes.
There were so many different reactions to it. Some people wish that they'd never heard. They were really angry by the news, feel that they can't fathom the thought that a human being could do this and refer to him as a monster. Some people feel that the person that was affected by these offences was no longer their loved one in that body. Other people have kind of taken the news and taken it in their stride and just accepted it. But I think the main reaction has been, how can someone do this and get away with this for so long? It's just unheard of.
We went to trial because David Fuller was saying in his defence that he had diminished responsibility, that he was not of sound mind when he killed Wendy and Caroline. On the 4th day of the trial, he changed his plea and he confessed to murdering Wendy and Caroline. And that was a massive moment.
Oh, it's after all these years, you know, it's a job to believe it so suddenly happened.
Wendy's mother told the court the murder had ruined her life. Fuller's crimes have caused decades of hurt.
I don't think about him as a person. The pain that he's caused these families, the torment that he's caused them, the despair for not only the families but all of the officers that have had to see this material and help these families through such an awful time is horrendous. He has completely shattered so many people's lives because of it.
He's betrayed the NHS, he's betrayed his colleagues, he's betrayed his profession. But we've all, every single one of us, has that same wish for someone that we've lost. And that's that they rest in peace. And he has betrayed that wish for all of us.